Coming up on this Thursday edition of Newsline at noon, President Park Geun-hye presides over the first meeting of the Unification Preparatory Committee to discuss reconciliation and an eventual reunification of the two Koreas. South Korea and the US agree in principle to postpone the transfer of wartime operational control of the South Korean military from Washington to Seoul till after the year 2020. First, Russian President Vladimir Putin orders a ban or a cut in food imports from countries that have imposed sanctions against Russia over the Ukraine crisis. These stories and more on Newsline at noon.
It's noon Thursday, August 7th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Ju.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broom. For the very first time, in fact, since it was launched last month, a special committee tasked with exploring ways to bring about a unification of the two Koreas met earlier on this Thursday.
The 50 committee members under the chairmanship of President Park Geun-hye are setting up a blueprint for how they'll go about accomplishing their ultimate goal of a peaceful reunification. Myung-kil reports.
The Park Geun-hye administration has placed a premium on economic reform in recent weeks, but has also shifted its focus back toward a unification drive with North Korea, an initiative that was overshadowed by April's ferry tragedy and the escalation of provocations out of North Korea. A 50-member special committee designed to conduct research on possible unification of the two Koreas and arouse greater public interest in the matter was launched last month. President Park has said that a reunification of the two Koreas will be an economic bonanza for the peninsula and neighboring countries. During a speech in Dresden, Germany in March, she called for bolstering cross-border exchanges as a first step toward building trust between the rival Koreas and laying the groundwork for unification. The committee will explore ways to make that happen. It is composed of 30 experts from the private sector, 2 National Assembly representatives, 11 government officials, and 6 heads of state-run research institutes. The two Koreas have been divided for more than 6 decades, following the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, which ended in a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. Myung-kil, Arirang News.
There's word out of Washington that the United States and South Korea are nearing an agreement to extend U.S. wartime operational control over the South Korean military by another 5 years from the current 2015 to 2020. Now, sources at high-level defense talks between the two sides say the allies believe Seoul needs more time to become fully capable of deterring North Korea's military threats. UDN reports.
Talks on transferring the wartime operational control of South Korean forces from Washington to Seoul are underway, and it looks like the transfer will be delayed by 5 years to 2020. Delegations led by Korea's Deputy Defense Minister Ryu Jae-seung and U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia David Helvey are currently in Washington to discuss the appropriate timing. Sources there say they agree South Korea's military needs more time to bolster its defense and other capabilities to counter threats posed by North Korea. This meeting is crucial as it could be the last round of talks before the two allies announce their agreement at their annual defense ministerial meeting in Washington in October. The U.S. took control of South Korean forces during the Korean War back in the early 1950s. Peacetime control was returned in 1994, and the South Korean military is set to achieve full autonomy next year if it takes over wartime operational control as previously scheduled. But following Pyongyang's third nuclear test in February last year, Seoul had asked Washington to delay the transfer. South Korea's defense minister Han Min-gu has also been pointing to the changing circumstances behind Seoul's request, emphasizing that North Korea has been carrying out realistic drills since Kim Jong-un took power in 2012. Yurian, Arirang News.
And North Korea seems to be actively expanding its nuclear program at its Yongbyon nuclear site. The U.S.-based Institute for Science and International Security said on Wednesday that satellite imagery from April and June shows there was an increase in activity surrounding a building that is known to store centrifuges, which are used to enrich uranium. This data suggests the North might be building more centrifuges inside the building to produce weapons-grade plutonium and enrich uranium for its nuclear weapons program. But the institute did add it wasn't sure whether the construction of the centrifuges had been completed. The White House is said to be planning a second round of talks with the Korean victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery sometime next month. Sources close to the meeting said Paulette Aniskoff, a director of the Office of Public Engagement at the White House, expressed her intention to invite two of the victims, Lee Ok-sun and Kang Il-chul, back to the executive office. Aniskoff is known to have shown strong sympathy to the women while listening to their harrowing wartime experiences last week. The sources say the follow-up meeting, if confirmed, is expected to involve not only U.S. officials from civil social affairs, but also those handling foreign and security policies. The White House's National Security Council, however, says it's not aware of any future meetings.
Turning now to the latest on the ground in Gaza. The 72-hour ceasefire there is holding for a second day, while representatives from Israel and Palestine are engaged in, quote, indirect talks to reach a longer-term truce. The negotiations are taking place in Cairo via Egyptian mediators, a process expected to be rather long and hard. Hamas says there has been no deal or understanding on an Israeli proposed truce extension, as the indirect talks are ongoing there in Egypt. Palestinians are calling for an end to Israel and Egypt's blockade of the Gaza Strip. And speaking for the first time since this 72-hour truce started, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Wednesday blamed the high civilian death toll in the conflict on Hamas, which he said had used residents as human shields. Meanwhile, the United Nations says more than 500,000 Gaza residents have been displaced in the battered enclave. That's about a third of the territory's inhabitants. Now, Israel's month-long pounding of Gaza shocked many people around the world due to the sheer force with which large parts of Gaza have been flattened, and thousands of Palestinians, including a great many women and children, have been killed or seriously injured. Mass demonstrations have been held in many of the world's major cities, and Seoul is no exception. Our Shin Se-min reports.
These are new chants that ring through central Seoul recently.
Pro-Palestinian activists are voicing their anger at what they believe is an unreasonable force being used by Israel in Gaza.
Organized by members of a Palestinian solidarity group and a non-profit organization called Nanum Munhwa, the activists plan another street protest on Friday to mark 1 month of the outbreak of violence in Gaza that has killed more than 1,800 people, most of them Palestinian. David Levy, the deputy chief of mission at the Israeli embassy in Seoul, expressed regret over the loss of innocent lives on both the Israel and Palestinian sides, but said the war isn't against the Palestinians, but rather against Hamas.
No country can accept missile fire aimed at civilians, and Israel has the right to defend itself and protect its citizens. And we are doing whatever we can when targeting Hamas to prevent any damage to non-involved civilians in Gaza.
Despite international efforts to bring about a peaceful resolution to the crisis, protesters in Seoul aren't optimistic.
We are not expecting anything from the world, really. The world is just the politicians are wasting time and others are selling guns. They are taking a chance for business.
The outrage was also directed at the South Korean government for selling arms to Israel. Amnesty International says arms trading between the two over the last 5 years has amounted to more than $20 million. The Korean government has yet to make an official statement on the matter. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Time now for a look through some of the other international headlines we're following on this Thursday afternoon. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim, standing by the news centre.
Eunice, it looks like the Ukraine crisis can now affect farmers in the West as Russia is poised to close its market to countries that impose sanctions on it.
That's right, Jinju, and it could have substantial impact on European farmers in particular, as Moscow is the biggest buyer of their fruits and vegetables. Here's Kwon So-ah with the details.
Responding to the tougher economic sanctions recently imposed on Russia by the EU and the US, Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a one-year ban of agricultural produce, food and vegetable imports on nations that have imposed sanctions against Russia. The government has been ordered to come up with a specific list of goods. Russia's move will have a big impact on Western exporters as Russia imports nearly a third of its fruit products from the EU, and the US is its second biggest poultry importer. In an attempt to lessen the impact on domestic consumers, Russian authorities say they're looking for alternative partners. Talks with Argentina, Ecuador, and Brazil are already scheduled for this week. Earlier, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev reportedly said Moscow was considering banning European airlines from flying to Asia over Siberia. The sanctions against Russia began with Russia's annexation of Crimea in March, but were strengthened last week, now targeting Russia's defense, financial, and oil sectors. This came in response to Russia's continuous support for pro-Moscow separatists in Ukraine.
We don't know yet whether sanctions are working. Sanctions are working as intended in putting enormous pressure and strain on the Russian economy. If you look at projections for Russian growth, what you're seeing is that the economy has ground to a halt.
Meanwhile, there are concerns Russia could be planning an invasion, as Moscow is believed to have massed some 20,000 combat-ready troops at its border with Ukraine. NATO says Moscow could go in on the pretext of a humanitarian or peacekeeping mission as Kiev gains ground on separatist-held territory. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
And turning next to the fight against the Ebola outbreak, the virus is now feared to have spread to the Middle East, with the death of a 40-year-old Saudi man under observation for an Ebola infection. He died at a hospital in Jeddah Wednesday after returning from a business trip to Sierra Leone. His samples have been submitted to U.S. and German labs for testing. Meanwhile, new figures released by the WHO show in the period between Saturday and Monday, there were 108 new cases of Ebola and 45 additional deaths in Guinea, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Liberia's president has declared a state of emergency. Appearing on national television late Wednesday local time, she said some civil rights may need to be suspended in order to get a handle on the outbreak. Liberia has recorded 282 Ebola deaths so far. And rescue operations continue in China's southwest. A miracle of sorts, though. An 88-year-old woman was saved out of the rubble from Sunday's devastating earthquake. Xiong Zhengfen was buried for some 50 hours before being found on Tuesday in Babao village near the epicenter of the magnitude 6.1 quake in Yunnan province. Doctors said her vital signs were normal. And China's Xinhua news agency also reporting another senior resident rescue. The 76-year-old is said to be in stable condition. Hundreds of others were not so fortunate. An additional 179 people were confirmed killed on Wednesday, bringing the overall death toll from the quake to 589. And turning to some space news, in a first, a European spacecraft dubbed Rosetta has successfully caught up with a flying comet following a 10-year chase. A 6.5-minute thruster burn brought Rosetta into, quote, orbit with the comet, and it will begin mapping its surface in detail. The hope is that the study of the comet, which has some of the oldest materials in the universe, will reveal clues to the origins of the solar system, its planets, and life itself.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea. Connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on Newsline at noon with Mark Broom and Jin-ju.
I'm Jin-ju.
Market researcher Strategy Analytics said Thursday that LG Electronics brought in about 11.
The ink is barely dry, but critics of a new bill that will provide tax cuts for conglomerates have come out in force. Korea's finance minister was also quick to defend the measures, saying they will ultimately spur economic growth. Kim Ji-yeon has the details.
Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan defended the tax revision on conglomerates. He dismissed criticism that the changes were to benefit only the heads of the country's biggest companies. In two separate interviews with Seoul-based broadcast networks MBC and SBS, Choi said the proposal is intended to encourage conglomerates to use their cash reserves in ways that would benefit the economy. When asked how confident he was about the economic impact, Choi said the message was clear that the plan is to boost domestic demand and thus create a virtuous cycle, one in which capital flows into households as a result of conglomerates making investments, paying out dividends, and raising the wages of their employees. Choi added that the Korean economy is going through hard times and that it's necessary to do structural changes to get the economy back on track. With wholesale and retail sales contracting as a result of the Seoul ferry disaster in April, the finance minister emphasized the need to restore consumer confidence. He says the revisions provide tax cuts to those paying in debit cards and in cash and extend exemptions of income taxes on credit card users. The country's gross domestic product increased a mere 0.6% in the second quarter of the year, its lowest level in 3 quarters. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Now, there are a number of factors behind the sinking of the Sewol ferry, and one of them is corruption. More than 40 officials will soon get their day in court on charges of overlooking safety concerns in exchange for money and other personal interest. Connie Kim reports on the new indictments.
43 officials linked to corrupt activities surrounding the operations of the sunken Sewol ferry have been indicted. Corruption in the marine transport industry has been identified as one of the main causes of the sinking that left more than 300 people dead or missing in April. A special investigation team at the Incheon District Prosecutor's Office says it has indicted officials from the Korea Shipping Association, the Oceans Ministry, the now-defunct Coast Guard, and the Korea Ship Safety Technology Authority. 18 have been arrested and 25 have been charged without detention. Charges against those arrested included the embezzlement of public funds for personal use, giving permission for the ship to operate without regular safety checks, and overlooking illegal acts. An official from the Korea Shipping Association also allegedly ordered those under him to permit the ferry operator to allow more passengers on board than were legally allowed. Other charges among officials who were not arrested included faking a shipping accident for insurance purposes. The prosecution is also calling for the establishment of institutions separate from Korea Shipping Association. It says the agency shouldn't have sole authority over shipping matters or operate without oversight. After prosecutors wrap up their investigation into the cause of the sinking and corrupt management within the Korea Shipping Association, it will continue its probe into whether the Korea Shipowners Association lobbied politicians regarding the ferry disaster. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
2 South Korean nationals were executed in China on Wednesday on charges of drug smuggling. Seoul's foreign ministry says the 2 men have been convicted of smuggling 15 kilograms of methamphetamine from North Korea and selling it to traffickers in China. Seoul reportedly asked for clemency for the 2, but the pleas fell on deaf ears in China, which said the same punishments applied to both domestic and foreign drug dealers. Seoul's foreign ministry expressed deep regret over the executions and said they will assist their bereaved families in bringing the bodies back to Korea. Another Korean man convicted on similar charges is awaiting execution, which could come as early as this week. Now, in light of the bullying scandals that have rocked the Korean military in the whole country as of late, New data shows that the number of offences by soldiers last year was the highest, in fact, in 5 years. Korea's main opposition party, New Politics Alliance for Democracy, revealed on Thursday that there were 7,530 cases taken to the military prosecution. That's more than an 8% increase from the previous year and the highest since 2009. Data shows that about 70% of the offences were unrelated to the military. Offences included physical beatings, sexual assaults and other criminal cases. Now, shifting gears now, and we're entering the era of wearable technology. Shipments of these wearable devices, such as smartwatches, are expected to top 19 million this year and jump about 80% annually over the next 5. And while there's little doubt that they add quite a lot of extra convenience to our lives, they're also adding to concerns about privacy. Our Kim Min-ji reports.
The explosive growth of wearable devices has also brought with it privacy concerns. According to a new report by Korea's National Information Society Agency, there are mounting fears of misuse or abuse of information, as wearable devices are able to collect a variety of personal information regardless of place or time. Front and center is Google Glass, which can record everything in view and share it in an instant. The product's facial recognition app, named Tag, is also raising alarms as a user can get their hands on personal information, including a person's name and their photos on social media, just by taking a photo of them. A U.S. senator has already called on Google to come up with measures so that the application only identifies people who have given the permission to do so. Other countries are also stepping up efforts to protect personal information. The British Data Protection Act prohibits the use of personal information attained through wearable devices for advertisement or business purposes. Australia also offers detailed guidelines when it comes to privacy invasion through the use of digital devices. Korea, on the other hand, has a lot of ground to make up. Wearable devices do not fall into the category of network cameras or image information processing devices, so relevant laws do not forbid their use. And to be punished by the current information network law, videos must contain pornography or violate privacy or portrait rights. The Korean agency's report points that there needs to be basic standards that can be applied to wearable devices. The Korea Communications Commission acknowledges there is a cause for concern and plans to review relevant laws and regulations. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now to some health news. A new study out of the UK says that an aspirin a day could potentially keep cancer away. Researchers at the Queen Mary University of London say that taking an aspirin every day can reduce the risk of developing or dying from bowel or stomach cancers by about 30 to 40%. The results are from 200 studies looking at the pros and cons of taking aspirin. The scientists say the benefits of aspirin will only show really after people between the ages of 50 to 65 take a daily dose of 75 to 100 milligrams for at least 5 to 10 years. Researchers, however, warn that taking aspirin long term can increase the risk of negative side effects like bleeding in the stomach.
Good afternoon. Today is known as Ipchu here in Korea, which according to the traditional solar calendar is the first day of autumn. It's also the last of 3 hottest days of the year. But readings in most areas are expected to hover below 30 degrees Celsius under lots of clouds and rain. We'll get sprinkles here in Seoul, but the East Coast areas will see heavy showers up to 60 millimeters during the day. And here are the readings for today. The afternoon high in Seoul and Daegu, Busan will all rise to 29, while Gwangju should peak at 30 this afternoon. And for other regions, it looks like Jeju Island and Daejeon will top out at 30 and 27, and Dokdo should top out at 24. Now, as for the typhoon Halong, it continues to move in a northeasterly direction, heading to mainland Japan. So Jeju and the southern and eastern coast of Korea will be indirectly affected by Halong over the weekend. So please do keep that in mind if you have plans in those areas over the next few days. Now, that's all for Korea, and here's the international weather for viewers around the world.
Well, those are the stories we're following at this hour.
Mark and I'll be back at the same time on Friday. Thank you for watching.